"Get out and go crawl back to your sister's place. Hope you don't catch pneumonia," he said, and then his hand shoved me so hard I tasted the night. I was on the porch in nothing but a thin nightgown, the kind that did nothing against the January wind. The cold hit like a physical thing, pushing at my lungs, crawling under the fabric to the skin at my shoulders. My slippers skidded on frosted boards. Behind me, the front door clicked shut in that final, ordinary way doors do when they mean to end everything. For a second, I simply stood there, stunned by the absurdity. The neighbors' holiday lights blinked too cheerfully across the street. A car sighed past, and my breath came out in white ghosts. I could feel the sting of humiliation hotter than the cold, the nightgown, the shove, the lock. Raymond had been my husband for 32 years. We'd shared a life that looked normal from the outside. Dinners, PTA meetings, plaques in his office. Then he said that line, like a verdict, and the living room behind him felt suddenly foreign. I remember thinking, not calmly at all, that I'd break a window rather than stand there and die of embarrassment. My knuckles balled. I stepped toward the nearest sash as if to test the glass with a palm. That was when the dark across the street unfolded, like the curtain of a stage, and the Whitmore house, always stately and unapproachable, lit up, and a woman appeared on the porch opposite ours. She moved with a kind of economy the rich cultivate. No hurry, no display, just a small motion of a hand and someone opened their front door. Constance Whitmore came across the snow in a cashmere shawl, the kind of woman whose coats don't ruffle when the wind blows. She stopped in front of me as if she had meant every yard between our houses and wrapped that shawl around my shoulders. The cashmere smelled faintly of lemon and old books, and it felt like someone had set a warm hand over my chest. She looked at me as if inventorying, then spoke without preamble. "You should not be standing there." Her voice was low and measured. Then, almost conversationally, she added, "My grandson runs the hospital where Raymond works. I won't tolerate that kind of behavior in my neighborhood." I wanted to laugh at the absurdity. My life had suddenly become someone else's problem. But beneath the absurdity was an ember of something hotter, relief. Not just for the shawl, but for the fact that a person with teeth and reach had appeared. Constance reached inside her bag and pulled out a thick pair of gloves, sliding my numb hands into them with the kind of efficiency I had only ever seen in operating rooms. She said, "Come in. You can call whoever you like from there." Then, as if tasting a sentence she'd already written, she told me, with a small, ruthless smile, "By this time tomorrow, he will be on his knees begging." Her certainty didn't feel like prophecy. It felt like a plan.
If this sounds dramatic, if it sounds like something that happens in movies and not in small cul-de-sacs where we had lived our life, I won't argue. I will only tell you what happened. Before Constance could take me inside, I had the reflexive need to explain myself, as if any explanation would keep Raymond from doing what he had done. He said, I began, and then I could not finish, because what was I supposed to say? That the man I had loved told me to go die? That he had locked me out and left me on the porch like an unclaimed package? Words failed, and the night air rushed in. A small, direct ask, if this is the kind of true account you come here for, raw, messy, and real, consider subscribing. I need you with me as I tell what came next. We went inside the Whitmore house. It was warm, and it smelled of coffee and old money, and Constance led me to a sitting room with deep chairs and an honest, serious fireplace. She arranged a blanket around my knees and poured tea that had been steeped long and proper. It steamed like a promise. I sat there, shivering and half hysterical, and she did not ask me to relive the shove. Instead, she asked me to tell the small, quiet things that had been wrong for months. Her method of asking was not a line of questions, but a series of small invitations. Tell me about the nights he wasn't home. Show me a bank statement. Who else knows about the clinic accounts? It is strange how betrayal accumulates like dust. You do not notice it in a single sweep. It lingers in the corners, in a missing teaspoon, an unfamiliar perfume on a collar. For a long time, I had nameable reasons to be unhappy. Raymond became colder. He began keeping odd hours. He was more particular about his shirts, more secretive with his phone. Once, when he did come home early, I teased him about a perfume on his lapel. He laughed in a way that was sour and said, "Be home by 6 to make dinner, Victoria," like it was a joke, and like he was setting the clock of our life back to some old instruction manual. I remember the words, because they felt like a demand and a dismissal at once. The real gravity, though, came from money. It started with tiny anomalies, a direct deposit that didn't show up on my statement, an invoice that didn't match the service we were billed for. Small things you could tell yourself were bank's errors, clerical mistakes, human error. I used to be a nurse. I could hold a chart and spot when numbers didn't add up. Once, while helping the hospital with a community outreach night, I sat at the hospital's temporary accounting table and used my phone to compare figures. I noticed line items, consultancy fees, transfers to names I didn't recognize, traced to stringed accounts that smelled wrong. When I asked Raymond about them, his answer was always a small, practiced irritation, the way someone deflects when they are hiding something. It's administration. It's politics. I wanted to believe him.
I wanted to trust the man who had been my anchor. Then Amber happened. Amber Chen was 26, bright, and new to the floor. She was a nurse with quick hands and a nervous laugh, and she started appearing in places she shouldn't. At first, it was a coincidence. Then it became a pattern. Receipts with her name, photos, one mistakenly sent to my phone, of a bouquet on a kitchen counter with a note signed A. She tried to explain away a sonogram she left open on a shared workstation as something she'd been curious about in a training module. Her face when I confronted her was a strange mixture of fear and resignation. Later I learned she was pregnant. I confronted Raymond at the kitchen table. We moved like two people who could no longer remember the steps of merry arguments, the slow circling, the weighing of words. I showed him the statements, the payments that had been funneled off, the names of companies like Meridian and Atlantic Prime Medical Services, names that sounded impressive but hid nothing so respectable. He smiled then, a smile that did not reach his eyes, and said, "You'll only worry yourself sick." He walked out of the room and through his office, and I could hear the soft click as he closed a drawer. The confrontation escalated because it had to. I called him out in a way I had not before, patient and crushed and furious. He reacted like someone hoarding against exposure, sharp, brittle anger that snapped like old nails. He shoved me. It wasn't meant to kill. It was meant to end the sentence of the argument. He sent me out. That shove pulled us back, to that porch and to the locked door. Only the Whitmore house remained between a ridiculous humiliation and something else. Constance's shawl and her crisp competence were the bridge I didn't know I needed. When I told Constance that night about the missing money, how invoices had been rerouted and how some payments to hospital vendors had been inflated, she listened without blinking. The way Constance listened made you feel like all of history was folding into the present, and she would decide what to do about it. She took a long time, not because she needed information, but because she was cataloging leverage. "Give me access," she said finally. "I will put someone on this." It was an odd offer to accept. The woman who had the means to fire people without blinking was offering me, an ex-nurse with a broken marriage, a chance to step into a system I barely understood. But I had been shoved into the cold and locked out of my home. The universe had simplified my options. I could retreat into shame, or I could try to name what had been done to me. Constance's someone was not a faceless investigator. It was the hospital itself, its records, ledgers, and those quiet corners where insiders hid things. She introduced me to a lawyer, quietly, and said, "You will have what you need. No one behaves like that in my community without consequences." I felt suddenly very small and very dangerous at once. The first days of the investigation were methodical and strangely intimate. I had to relearn how to look at paper the way I had once learned to read heart monitors, to notice the smallest irregularity, the faint beep that meant trouble. We followed receipts that had been split into smaller transfers. We found vendor addresses that went to mailboxes in strip malls, and shell company registrations that pointed to empty offices. We found marked up invoices where the cost of a supply order had been increased 5, 10, 30%. Meridian was a name used in invoices and contracts. Atlantic Prime Medical Services was a ghost with a charming logo. There were moments of furious adrenaline when I found a chain of emails that named Raymond as the authorizer for payments to a firm that, on paper, did not exist. There were quieter, enraged moments when I located a photograph of Amber in a file labeled Events, smiling as if unaware she was part of a ledger and not a person. The indignity of watching a human life become a line item made my skin prickle. We did not rush.
Constance insisted on accuracy. She believed in pressure applied slowly, like steam. If we wanted results that would hold up, not theatrical justice as in a binge-worthy show, but legal accountability, we had to be precise. I learned to be patient in new ways. I made lists. I learned that sometimes proof arrives in the form of pattern, the same courier used for invoices every month, the same P.O. box, the same dusty signature. Patterns whisper. There were near misses. Once, files that should have been there, a set of receipts, did not appear where we expected. A backup had been overwritten. An email thread was missing. Some records were redacted. Each time we hit a blank, the world rewired my anxiety into a different beast. Not raw fear, but a cold proficiency to ask, who benefited from this gap? We did not speculate beyond reason, but every blank felt like a hand trying to cover the truth. Marcus Whitmore entered the story later than Constance and with a different flavor. He was young, groomed, and the sort of person whose brilliance had been pointed at the right places. He had the title and the circulation of power that comes with being the heir apparent to a family business. Constance referred to him with a curious mix of tenderness and impatience that reminded me of practiced theater criticism. Marcus has responsibility, she would say, but he also has appetite. He agreed to meet with me once, as if it were a favor to his grandmother. When Marcus walked into the room for the first time, he had the look of a man who was used to being believed. He shook my hand with a grip that seemed intended to reassure me, and then sat with his knees together, hands folded. He listened to the summary of anomalies with a grave face. It was odd, almost theatrical, how he carried the weight of consequence on someone else's shoulders.
In private, Marcus and I had an exchange that later felt like the hinge of everything. He told me, quietly and without flourish, that he had been trying to keep certain things quiet because the hospital's reputation mattered. He said a phrase that was not an apology and not exactly a defense. He complained about pressures, debts, obligations, the way the board's expectations hung on him. There was shame in the way he spoke. It was not a man full of swagger. He said he had been compromised. I thought he meant moral compromise. He later admitted, under duress, that those were the kinds of compromises he had made. For a while after that meeting, I believed him. I wanted to. He seemed vulnerable and tangled, and his confession fit neatly into a narrative I could understand. A younger man ensnared by debt, making a series of bad decisions to protect a fragile position. I imagined whispered deals in late-night rooms, dinners where favors were traded for silence. I wanted to feel he could be redeemed, but redemption requires admission and repair. What I saw were moments of blinking avoidance and unexplained transfers. As we dug deeper, we found more. Photographs of Amber with documents, invoices routing funds to companies registered under aliases, transfers that circled back in ways that suggested money moving like a snake through the system, always ending with a hand that benefited. Evidence was not always glamorous. Much of it was paper, and the emotion came afterwards, when you saw how those lines had a human cost. I kept thinking about Amber's face, about the small life inside her, about the way it had been folded into the balance sheet and labeled as a cost of doing business. Tension rose inside me in phases. There were moments when I felt like an investigator, calm and clear, cataloging wrongs. There were other moments when I was a wife in ruins again, furious and ashamed at how easily a life could be governed by someone else's lies. Somewhere between those poles, I found resolve. Constance's coolness helped with that. She could be an engine of strategy, but she had a certain moral telos. Someone had to be accountable. For all her wealth, she seemed to hunger for a kind of restoration that was not about money. It was about restoring the rulebook so others would not be hurt the same way. It was during one of those long nights of sorting that the first serious obstruction happened. We had compiled a presentation, something meant for the board, a careful, surgical display of evidence, marked invoices, a map of transfers, photos, dates. I had rehearsed the narrative 100 times in my head. I would not use melodrama. I would present facts and let them do their work. Constance planned the evening at which the board and a select group of insiders would see it. The night before the meeting, my laptop, my orderly, strangely comforting rectangle of truth, was there on the dining table, open to the slides.
I had closed it for 5 minutes to reheat soup, and when I came back, a shadow had passed over the screen. Someone had been in my house. The presentation file was gone. I remember the way the room seemed to tilt. I called Constance immediately, my voice sharp and animal. She came over before I finished the sentence, moving through my kitchen like she had owned it for years. A detective might have called it a breach. My first, baser thought was that Raymond had come back and stolen it to hurt me, but there were more dangerous possibilities. Someone inside the hospital could have anticipated our moves. Someone could have reached into my home and erased the work of weeks. My instinct that night was not to explode in fury, but to control my face. Constance placed her hand on my shoulder, light and decisive, and spoke in that small voice that ordered the room. "Do not panic. We will find another way." There was comfort there, but also an awful knowledge. The fight had gone noisy. Whoever had taken the file wanted us to feel like we had failed. The next morning, with coffee cooling untouched, we found a note that felt like mockery. "Try harder." It was unsigned. It might have been a stranger's prank, or it might have been a deliberate act of intimidation. The plausible reading was the more dangerous one. Someone with access and resources had been in my life. We reached out, quietly, to people who could locate files and places I didn't know existed. Constance called a number, gave a name, and a voice on the other end said, "We will check the mirroring now." I didn't know what that meant, beyond that it sounded like a technical thing she had arranged in advance. Constance had a way of speaking in resources, names that implied an infrastructure of help. It made me feel in odd spurts, like a chess player with a secret move. But the work required me to do something I had avoided, to look at Raymond as a criminal, and not only as the man I had loved. It's impossible to describe the split that made. You do not stop seeing the small, loyal things he once did, but you also catalog the betrayals. The evidence forced me to stop skirting the shape of him and to face the sum of what he had done. Then Marcus did something that felt like a physical blow. He came to my office with a look I had no language for, calm, a little too rehearsed. He placed a thumb drive on my desk and did not meet my eyes when he told me that he thought this would settle everything. "It's a recording," he said. "It's of a conversation that proves," and he stopped like a man who had just given himself away. On the drive home that night, the little flash of plastic in my palm felt heavier than any brick. Constance put it into evidence as accepting a relic. We played the file in a secure room. The voice was Marcus's, then another, someone I recognized from the hospital back end, and the recording suggested a conversation about favors and payments.
It was humiliating and small and lethal in exactly the way that corrupt bargains are. Not spectacular, but precise. It showed Marcus in a compromising position, agreeing to a favor for silence. When I looked up from the speakers, Marcus's face was drained of its veneer. That afternoon, he confessed something I had already suspected. He had been paying some debts, the kind of debts that start small and grow like tumors when fed by shame. Gambling was one explanation he offered, alongside board pressure. He said he had been blackmailed into certain decisions. His shame was not a clean cut. He seemed squeezed between loyalty to family and a fear of ruin. He said that he had been weak, and that he had chosen the wrong way to save things. I did not want to go easy on him merely because his eyes were red. I wanted accountability. But I had, in a strange and human place in my chest, a softening. He was not a cartoon villain. He was a person who had been caught between appetites and obligation. And his confession, though it implicated him, also promised something I had not expected, a desire to undo what had been done. We planned to present evidence, including the recording. We would show how Meridian's invoices matched payments that diverted hospital funds to a shadow company. We would show Amber's photographs and the invoices that indicated those funds seeded a secret venture Raymond denied. We would bring the board to see not a soap opera, but a ledger of real harm. And then the presentation file disappeared. I remember the meat of the panic as a series of small mechanical interventions. Calls placed, people who did not pick up, a door that had been propped open. There were moments where my breath was short, and my hands shook, and I thought of leaving, running, undoing the whole thing and going somewhere anonymous. But Constance moved like someone who had been building contingencies for a time we did not know about. She did not panic. Instead, she did a thing almost my nurse's instincts recognized as triage: preserve the vital signs that could be preserved. She told me quietly that we would not step into the board with the evidence.
She said we would make sure the narrative could not be erased again. The tone of her voice made it plain she had expected trouble. The way she said it made it cleaner too. Strategic, measured, practical. I could see how the neighborhood had always whispered about the Whitmores, the way their influence slotted into civic life like a bone. I had not wanted to step into that sphere, and now I needed it. Raymond had no inkling, I thought, of the machinery Constance could bring to bear. He thought his shove and his lock were enough to silence me. He had underestimated the extent to which a single shove could illuminate things that had been carefully hidden. For a moment, I permitted myself a brutal, private satisfaction that the man who had once told me to be home by 6 to make dinner had, in his sprawling arrogance, built his house on sand. That whoever he thought he was, respected director, family man, had also spent years creating loopholes that allowed private enrichment. But satisfaction is a strange thing when you are in the middle of a wound. It does not comfort you so much as fuel the work you are about to do. We reassembled. We found witnesses, people at the hospital who had noticed discrepancies but had been afraid because the stakes were careers, reputations, mortgages. They were the ones who finally, in their wearied way, decided the ledger was more important than the quiet. They brought their own small shards of papers, a receipt here, an email there, the kind of glue that holds a larger picture. The late nights blurred. There were cramped rooms lit by laptop screens and the hushed clinking of porcelain as we sipped tea and kept each other awake. Constance moved pieces like a general. Marcus vacillated between contrition and terror. Amber's name and the evidence of her pregnancy kept looping in my head. A human life layered into a balance sheet. I thought of her and of the choices that had no space for conscience because the system demanded silence. And yet, just as we thought we had traction, a new, deeper uncertainty entered. Someone within Constance's own circle whispered that Marcus's actions might not have been entirely voluntary, that he had, at times, been more victim than villain, shamed into choices by threats we could only imagine. That complexity did not excuse his choices, but it complicated the emotional arithmetic. You could not, in good conscience, reduce everyone to the same moral coin. We planned a gala as the stage. Constance wanted the revelation public, with witnesses and the press and people who mattered. She wanted a space where there would be no back door for a hurried cover-up. It would be theatrical and precise. We would show the evidence. We would let justice move in the light, not in whispers. And then the presentation disappeared. I sat at my kitchen table and watched the sun move through the windows as if it were the only reliable thing left. The files that had taken us weeks were gone. The act of losing them felt like losing a limb. It was suddenly harder to breathe. I thought of Amber and the ledger and all the small betrayals that had stacked into an economy of harm. Constance did not allow despair to flourish. She executed contingencies that 3 days earlier had been invisible to me. A line of people who arranged for physical mirrors of data, for paper backups tucked away in unexpected places, for steps that did not live on fragile hard drives. We gathered the reconstituted file into a new presentation that felt thicker and more resistant. We rehearsed the way we would show the slides, the language we would use to describe the transfers.
We practiced the images of invoices and the careful way we would point out names. We aimed at undeniable clarity. It was the morning before the gala when it happened, the flash in the stairwell, the phone call that turned my blood cold. A courier had arrived at Constance's office with a package that should not have been visible to anyone but the board. Inside was a signed statement. Someone had decided to be the first to pull a thread. The handwriting was neat and quiet. It said simply that a set of transfers had been authorized and that certain people had benefited. When I read it, I felt my stomach drop, then tighten with purpose. If we could corroborate this signed piece with the reconstituted files, then we had something that could move beyond rumor. If not, then we would be left with theater and anger. The line between the two was always paper thin. That afternoon, Marcus came to me. He looked at me as if he had rehearsed this exchange 100 times and still could not get the tone right. "I'm scared," he said, which was the plainest sentence I have ever heard a man in his position make. I believed him. I also believed he had participated in choices that harmed people. He reached for something like redemption.
Then, at the worst possible moment, a file that we had counted on vanished from the mirror. A document that tied a transfer to a specific P.O. box and a certain pass-through company simply was gone. It didn't make sense. We had backups, we had redundancies. It felt like a trap that had been left for us to fall into. I held the phone and felt a rage that was both wild and lawful. This fight was no longer just about my marriage. It was about how easily institutions swallow accountability. It was about how people hide behind titles. It was about Amber's child and the ledger of someone's greed. I paced until Constance's assistant suggested I sit. We mapped possibilities. We named suspects. We tried, with the limited vocabulary of the frightened, to outmaneuver a system that had already learned how to hide. And in the middle of that chaos, I found a quietness that belonged neither to fear nor to triumph. It belonged to a woman who had been shoved out of her home and had decided that the shove would not be the final chapter. I felt, with a clarity that was almost painful, the shape of the work ahead. Expose, account, change. We would need allies. We would need witnesses who were willing to risk careers, reputations, pensions. We would need to trust that truth, when sharp and clean, could cut through the rot. We would need Marcus's cooperation and Amber's courage to tell her story. We would need to believe that Constance's network could hold. That night, as I folded a blanket over my knees and watched the snow press against the window, I thought of all the small ways I had been invisible for 32 years. The dinners I made, the jobs I left my hands for, the trust I extended without checking the balance sheet of reciprocity.
I thought of the ledger and how it had redefined lives into numbers. I thought of what it would mean to reverse it, to take back control, not with spectacle, but with facts. I slept poorly and dreamed of hands, hands taking, hands giving, hands that had shoved me onto a porch. In a dream that felt like a memory, Raymond's voice said, as he often had in moments of rage or humor, "Be home by 6 to make dinner, Victoria," and the words left the dream like an echo from a life I had once inhabited without wariness. In the morning, we learned that a second person had come forward, someone who claimed to have seen transfers. Their statement was raw and short, but it mattered because it existed. Constance smiled a tiny, satisfied smile that was either cruel or blessed. I could not decide. Her people were assembling more than papers. They were gathering testimonies, the soft human things that sometimes make for proof. We made plans for the gala. I practiced my voice in the shower, careful to keep it steady. I wrote slides that would not sensationalize Amber, but would show how funds had been rerouted. I made a note to keep Marcus's complexity present when I spoke. He was complicit, yes, but also someone shaped by fear and habit. I promised myself I would not clap like a judge. I would present like a nurse reading a chart. Plain, precise, unembellished. The night before we were to go public, someone copied part of the mirror and left it for us, 3 folders in a courier bag that arrived with no return address. They contained invoices, numbered and signed, matching what we thought we had lost. It felt like fate, or the last turn of a clever plan. It felt like a hand reaching through the dark to steady us. But comfort, I had learned, was provisional. The world kept moving in ways that required constant vigilance. I put the folders into a locked cabinet and asked Constance if she had ever been afraid like this. She looked at me, surprised by the question. "Of course," she said. "Fear is a lubricant for action. Use it." We rehearsed one more time. The slides, the order, the images of Amber, the document that connected the transfers. We rehearsed the part where I would step forward and tell a room full of people the truth about a man they had long respected. It felt like standing on a cliff's edge and being asked not to panic. On the morning of the gala, I sat in my car and watched people stream into a ballroom. I thought of the many small indignities that had led us here. The shove on the porch, the missing paychecks, the smile in a photograph. I thought about how many people would look at Raymond and continue to see what they had always wanted to see, a director who had done his work. I thought about how many others would see past the costume to the ledger beneath. We had a plan. We had papers. We had witnesses who had been brave enough to sign their names. We had the Whitmore reach.
We had Marcus's confession and Amber's photo and the courier bag with numbers that matched. The stage was set. And then, in a move that felt like someone was testing whether we were ready, Marcus walked into my small office with a look I remember as if it were a photograph, pale, slightly wild, as if the weight of what was coming had already bent him. He held up his phone and said, "I can make it stop." I understand how that looks on the surface, a confession of guilt, but the sentence carried a threat under its promise. It suggested that he could undo the thing we were about to expose. It suggested that there were more hands at play. It suggested again that power is porous, and threats are cheap. I told him quietly and without drama that we could not be stopped by fear. He asked me to consider the consequences for his family. I thought of the many people implicated, Amber and her child, the vendors, the nurses who had been paid less when funds were diverted. I thought of the night I had been shoved out into the cold. I thought about the shape of justice that would not be vengeful, but accountable. We walked toward the ballroom that night knowing there would be no perfect moment. We knew people would be watching. We knew Raymond would be under stress. We knew Marcus's presence made everything more dangerous because he could break in ways we did not predict. At the doorway, someone touched my arm, and Constance said the thing that felt like a promise and a threat both. By this time tomorrow, he will be on his knees begging. I did not laugh. I did not feel triumphant. I felt the thin calm of someone who had been shoved into the cold and decided that the weather would not dictate the rest of her life. I had taken a step that would end one kind of life and possibly begin another. The doors opened and we moved inside. The room smelled of perfume and aftershave and the low hum of polite conversation. Chandeliers pinned people in place. The board members sat like islands of decorum. Raymond greeted people with the practiced warmth of someone who had been trained to look comfortable and steady. I carried my notes like a talisman. My hands were not steady, but my voice would be. Then, 30 minutes before my presentation, the unexpected happened. My primary slide deck, freshly reconstructed, the one we had rehearsed, was missing again from the main server. Our source told us it had been there an hour ago. Now it was gone. I felt the old sensation of falling, of blinds closing. It was as if someone was daring us to continue in full knowledge that our evidence might evaporate. I told Constance. She reached for me and said nothing, then dropped her hand and went into motion. People around us began to murmur. The room tightened like a wound. We were given options, and none of them were clean. I could try to speak without the slides. I could call attention to the theft in front of people who would either believe me or think I have made a scene.
I could walk out and make the fight public in a different way. Each option had its own risk. Each had potential loss. The unknown was thick in the air. We were at the tipping point. The work we had done could be erased in one brushed hand, or it could land like a stone. I remember thinking of the porch as I stood there. The shove, the lock, the cold that had felt like a seal. That porch had been an accident of fate, but it had been the hinge of everything. Whoever had devised the locks and the quiet payments had thought themselves safe. They had not considered the friction of truth when it is pushed by the right people. I took a breath, opened my mouth, and prepared to tell a room of people why this man, Raymond Price, needed to answer for what his hands had touched. I took a breath, opened my mouth, and prepared to tell a room of people why this man, Raymond Price, needed to answer for what his hands had touched. The ballroom flattened my throat, hundreds of faces like a slow tidal line, but my voice came steady. I began with facts, dates, invoices, transfers. I did not cry, I did not beg. I read the numbers like a nurse reads a chart, clear and unadorned. The chandeliers threw light like interrogation lamps. The murmurs faded into a kind of careful listening. Then the projector blinked and went black. A technical hiccup, someone said, and a handful of people laughed politely. My throat tightened. We had rehearsed this, every contingency, but the same old trick of absence crawled over my confidence. The slide with the Meridian invoices, the courier receipts, the photograph of Amber with the sonogram, gone. Constance's hand found my elbow the way she had found my shoulder in my kitchen, quiet, anchoring. She mouthed something I could not read, then tapped her phone. A minute later, the event manager strode up, apologetic and flustered. "There's been an issue with the main server," he said, as if the word could unclench my chest. They offered me a microphone and no slides. I could have spoken without the visuals and let the story live in words alone. Said like that, it sounded brave. I had rehearsed the cadence of truth too many times to be undone by a bulb. But the point was not theater, it was accountability that could not be shrugged off by a clever publicist. I needed more than oratory, I needed proof that would not evaporate when someone with access wished it to. At that moment, Constance stood, moved through the crowd, and tapped the podium. The room turned toward her like a sea shifting. She walked slow and calm, the way she had walked across my porch the night I was locked out. She placed a leather folio on the lectern, and then, with a kind of economy that had quietly run entire hospital boards, she said, "If you will allow us a moment." The lights dimmed. Her assistant, a woman who moved with the assurance of someone used to confinement of emergencies, lifted a flash drive from a pocket and fed it into the podium.
The screen hummed, and then the slides bloomed.
only this time they were not the delicate file that had been vulnerable on a server. These were thicker, edged in courier marks, stamped and time-logged in ways that felt like a paper anchor. They were physical. They could not be waved away with a keystroke. A hush moved through the crowd. I watched Raymond's face, which had been carefully managed all evening, become a portrait of slow unraveling. He smiled politely at first. Then that smile thinned. Color drained from his cheeks. He leaned toward a colleague and murmured, "Too quiet for me, but clear enough for my blood to heat." Somewhere else, someone had finally removed his cloak. We ran through the presentation, slide by slide. The Meridian invoices matched the routing numbers we had traced. The Atlantic Prime contracts showed the same vendor addresses that led to P.O. boxes. There were photographs, a candid of Amber laughing, a sonogram image tucked into a desk drawer, copies of checks. We played the courier manifest that linked dates and signatures. Each new frame landed like a small, undeniable pound of a gavel. When the slide with the recorded conversation played, the room tightened in a different way. I had not planned to expose the audio on that stage, not in that sentence, but its bluntness felt necessary. Marcus's voice came through, uneasy, admitting favors in a tone that offered both shame and the weight of complicity. The clip did not need embellishment. It showed a man linking his name to transactions in the manner of someone who had been pressured into decisions he could not later justify. Marcus rose from his seat before the audio finished. He had the look of someone about to give an account he had long avoided. He walked to the stage as if guided by a rope he could not see. When he reached the lectern, he did not speak in rehearsed corporate cadences. He spoke like someone who finally decided to be honest. "I made terrible choices," he said. His voice broke once, and he swallowed. "I was in debt. I was selfish. I thought I could keep it from harming anyone. I was wrong. I helped make decisions that hurt people, and for that I am ashamed." He named no excuses beyond the simple human failures we all recognize: gambling, fear, shame. He said he had been blackmailed, and that for a time he had convinced himself his actions were saving the hospital's reputation. He did not ask for absolution. He asked to be accountable. There was a tremor of sympathy in the room, an awkward human recognition that a person could be both confession and complicity. But Marcus did not turn the spotlight away from Raymond. Instead, he described meetings, approvals, the fact that invoices had been pushed through by a hand that wasn't his alone. In that confession, he offered something we had been building toward: corroboration. Raymond's reaction was the last thing I expected. He rose slowly, as if dizzy.
For a moment, he seemed to consider speaking, to defend himself with the practiced billionaire's calm that had worn so well for decades. Instead, he made a small movement for the door, an instinctive attempt to exit before consequences could take shape. That motion was a bad calculation. Plainclothes officers at the edge of the stage, arranged quietly by Constance's counsel and the board members who finally grasped the scope, moved in. I won't claim it was cinematic. It was abrupt and businesslike. An officer stepped forward and said plainly, "Mr. Price, you're under arrest." There were gasps. Some people clutched champagne flutes like they could press the scene back into a polite narrative. Raymond's face went through stages: insult at being stopped, rage, then a kind of disbelieving fury. He protested. "This is ridiculous," he barked, voice high and brittle, but the handcuffs clicked with the normalcy of a hospital clock. He was led away while murmurs swelled into a rustle of disbelief. I felt no triumph in watching him escorted out, only a cold, measured relief that the ledger had been made to answer. Marcus sat down again, his shoulders quivering. He did not collapse into self-pity. He gave a short statement to the assembled press about mistakes and a willingness to cooperate. Later, outside the ballroom, a reporter would ask if he feared prison. He looked older than his years and answered, "I fear the harm I've caused more than anything." Constance did not allow the night to become a whirlwind of accusations without governance. She approached the podium with a decisiveness that made the room still. "This institution needs leadership," she said. "It needs transparency and repair. We will not let this moment become merely a spectacle." She turned to me then, in front of everyone, and did what no one had done publicly in my life. She nominated me, in that precise executive way she used with board chairs and charity trustees, as the interim head. "Victoria Price will serve as interim CEO while we begin a formal audit and a search for permanent leadership," she declared.
My name in that context felt heavy and strange. For years, I had been defined by a marriage and a courtesy of partnership, and now it sat on a podium like a job title. I walked up with hands that remembered the steadiness of IV poles and the precision of sutures, not corporate hierarchies. But I had done the work that night like surgery, careful, exact, and aimed at removing what was rotten. Once the room had broken into a scatter of exclamations, some supportive, some skeptical, I was handed the microphone. I thought of Amber then, of the small human ledger that had been miscounted as collateral. I thought of the nurse who had been promised a future, only to find herself folded into another man's ambitions. I thought of the porch and the way a single shove could change a life's course. My voice was rough, but it held. "I am not here for revenge," I said.
I am here for accountability, for the nurses who worked overtime and never saw a bonus, for families who trusted healthcare and were charged in ways that hid the truth, for Amber, and for any woman who was reduced to a line item so someone else could raise his private stake. I spoke of the reforms we would pursue: transparent audits, protections for whistleblowers, restorative funds where misappropriations had left staff and patients unpaid. I did not promise miracles. I promised work that would be relentless. The press surrounded us after the arrests were made. Marcus, Raymond, Amber's name, everything fed headlines. But Constance insisted the conversation not become consumption. She asked the board to convene an emergency meeting the next morning, to place a hold on related accounts, to contact regulators. I watched decisions that would determine other people's livelihoods unfold under her cold, practical supervision. It was not grandstanding. It was a cleanup operation, with bones and maps. Amber reached out to me privately 2 days later. She had watched the gala on a loop of live clips like the rest of the world. Her voice on the phone was small and careful. She did not ask for pity. She asked for help, for herself and for the child she was carrying. She wanted anonymity and a plan. We arranged that, quietly. Medical care, counseling, legal resources. Her name in my mouth was a vow. The days that followed were a sedimentation of interviews, statements, and the slow, grinding mechanics of accountability. Raymond was charged with fraud and other counts that I will not catalog here like a checklist. You can look up what happened if you need the formal record. Marcus cooperated. His testimony included admissions that hurt him and helped us. He gave details of pressures and of the moments he had succumbed to fear. There were no clean absolutes. He did not become a saint overnight. He became in the public eye, a man who had to reckon with how his choices harmed others. I was appointed interim CEO in name, and in practice I had the task people expect of new leaders: steadying meetings, listening to staff who felt betrayed, and rewriting the ledger that had been used against them. I walked the hospital floors the way I had once walked them in scrubs, listening to nurses who had not felt safe to speak before. I set up confidential lines for staff to report concerns, and insisted, with Constance's voice echoing, on transparency that would survive scrutiny. We started a process of restitution where possible, and worked with auditors to untangle what had been done. There were hard days. Not everyone trusted the change. Some saw me as a celebrity interloper. Others suspected my motives. I had to learn bureaucracy as I had once learned to read monitors, to notice the rhythm, to apply pressure where necessary, and to be patient with small outcomes that, over time, might become real reform.
Amber's case became a measure of how serious we were. She received support, and though systems are slow, that concrete help mattered. People asked me how revenge felt. It did not. It felt like relief and responsibility. There was a cost. Relationships that had been comfortable were severed. Reputations that had been lubricated by power collapsed, and some allies turned out to be fair weather. But there was also the surprising gift of solidarity. Nurses who had been frightened by politics found their courage. Board members who had been complacent confronted their complicity. The hospital's financials were cleaned up, gradually, painfully. The community, patients, staff, vendors, began to ask hard questions they had once avoided. Constance visited once, not to command, but to sit, to have tea and listen to the mechanics of rebuilding. She looked at me over her cup, and we shared a small, private acknowledgement of the distance we had crossed. "You were pushed out into the cold," she said softly, "and you turned that shove into motion." I thought of my porch a lot after that. It has a different meaning now, not merely the place of humiliation, but the hinge of a transformation.
That night on the cold wood, when the door clicked, everything that had been tense and thin in my life clarified into either work or wreckage. I chose work. There were quieter reckonings. Friends who had stood by Raymond wrestled with their loyalty. Some apologized. Others could not reconcile what they had believed with what the ledger showed. I resisted the satisfaction of moral triumph. Accountability, I learned, is not a final prize, but an ongoing vigilance. Months later, in a meeting with the board, a reporter asked if I thought this outcome could be replicated by everyone who had been wronged. I answered plainly, no. Systems of power do not unmake themselves on command. They are slow to shift and require persistence. I would not offer a universal prescription. I could only bear witness to what had happened in my life. A shove that led to exposure, a neighbor who turned out to be an ally with resources, and a choice to move forward rather than yield. People asked if I was free now. In some ways, yes. Free from the private betrayals that had hollowed me out. In other ways, no. The work of undoing harm is expansive and never fully complete. I carried scars in my chest that woke at odd hours, and there were nights when the porch's cold seemed to visit me in dreams. But there was also a growing ease, the sound of my own voice in a boardroom, nurses who trusted me enough to tell their truth, and a child whose future had been given a chance at better care. At the hospital's first public meeting after the arrests, I stood at the podium and read the names of small reforms: transparency measures, restitution funds, a fund for staff education. I did not grandstand. I offered a simple truth. Institutions must answer for how they treat people.
If the system protects the powerful at the expense of the vulnerable, it must be changed. The press asked me once if I forgave Raymond. I said forgiveness is not a single act. It is a path you choose to walk or not. For now, I chose to walk toward a life reclaimed, toward work that restored. I would not pretend the hurt was small. It was enormous. But it did not have to be the final story. As the weeks turned to months, Amber gave birth. She named the child quietly and asked that their privacy be respected. I became a small part of a chosen support network. Nothing official, nothing performative, just people who showed up when domestic life demanded food, care, and the slow rebuilding that happens in kitchens and at doctor's visits. Her presence in my life reminded me that the ledger had real faces and that our accountability had to be tender as well as rigorous. Constance never sought public credit. She attended board meetings like a force of nature in a cashmere coat, precise, sometimes frightening, always effective. Once, in a quiet corridor, she took my hand and said, "You did not need me to tell your truth. You needed me to move what you already had." I would not diminish what she did for me. She provided leverage that my story alone could not reach. But she also taught me how to wield influence with a moral center, rather than merely amass power. In the months that followed, Raymond faced legal proceedings. I will not recount them as moral lessons. They were messy, procedural, and subject to systems that move slowly. I will not promise that every story ends this way. I will, however, say what I know. In this case, the ledger was made to speak. People were held to account. Marcus cooperated and began a path of restitution. Amber and her child found stability. The hospital began to rebuild trust. When I look back, the thing I keep returning to is the porch and the moment that cracked my life open. The shove was an ending and an opening. It forced a choice I had avoided for years, to accept humiliation or to name the truth. Choosing the truth has been expensive and difficult, but it has been the only way forward I could accept. At the gala, when Constance rose and said, "By this time tomorrow, he will be on his knees begging," she spoke a sentence that felt like a wager and us both. It was not the whole story. It was a provocation. It was a challenge to power. And, in the small arc of our world, it was part of what made accountability possible. I am not a hero. I am a woman who was shoved into a cold night and who refused to let that shove be the final word. I took the resources placed before me, the evidence we assembled with care, and the courage of people who finally spoke, and I turned them into something that could not be erased with a keystroke. The work continues. The hospital continues to change. Lives continue to be repaired.
some slowly, some visibly.
The cost of complicity was tall. The cost of truth is still being counted. If this story matters to you, consider subscribing to hear more accounts of resilience and reform. We need witnesses as this kind of work keeps moving. What comes next is the rising.